In one of my older videos, I covered the Japanese battleship Hyuga, the second of the Issei class, best known for a dubious conversion, the only battle carriers to ever see service, although they never used aircraft in combat. Battlestars, these were not. That said, in today's video, we'll be looking at Issei herself, from her origin as an improved take on the Fuso class to that conversion and her ultimate fate. This was a story that began in the early 1910s. When initially planning the Fuso class, the Japanese were going for 4 ships. Issei and Hyuga were originally going to be the second pair of ships built to that design, or a slightly improved variation on it. However, the Japanese economy wasn't quite up to building it all in one go. In point of fact, of the 4 ships the Navy wanted, only one was initially ordered, that being Fuso alongside the 4 Congos. The other 3 were ordered in 1913. Of these, only Yamashiro would be laid down to the original design late in 1913. Issei and Hyuga, while ordered, needed more funding to be released before construction could begin. This would take until July 1914, a delay that Japanese naval designers took full advantage of as it turned out. They would take experience gained in building Fuso, laid down in 1912, and run with it. A few major changes resulted from this, the most visually obvious being the main battery layout. Less obviously, the secondary battery saw some reworking, while the third notable change came in relation to speed. These changes would, of course, delay construction for a fair bit. Despite being ordered in 1913 and funded in 1914, Issei wouldn't be laid down until May 10th of 1915, and not launched until November 2nd, 1916, with the ship finally commissioned on December 15th of 1917. While certainly an improvement, however marginal on Fuso, by this point most foreign navies had moved on from turret-farmed battleships. Issei came out looking a tad anachronistic in comparison to her contemporaries, such as Pennsylvania, Queen Elizabeth, and Bayer. Still, any improvement is still an improvement. Let's look at what the Japanese got out of Issei in the end. With a displacement of 31,260 tons at the normal load, Issei was a large ship for the time. This rose to as high as 36,500 tons when fully loaded. By comparison, Fuso was 30,600 tons normal and 35,900 when fully loaded. Not a major difference, but that's because of the changes to the firepower. First off, the main battery. Wanting to simplify the layout while retaining the ability to engage multiple ships, the Japanese completely rearranged it. On Fuso, the amidships turrets were carried separately. This required placing the second funnel, and by extension boiler rooms, between the turrets. That meant an extra magazine space behind the funnel, with attendant issues in heating the powder with all the exhaust piping from the boiler room. Not to mention spreading out the magazine spaces and making the boiler room a bit cramped, while also limiting the firing angles of the turrets. To rectify this, the Japanese moved the 4th turret. Issei would have 3 super-firing pairs, a standard pair on the bow and stern, and a 3rd pair behind the funnels. You might think this would lead to a shorter ship, but that isn't the case, as we'll see. Regardless, while the layout may have changed, The weaponry certainly didn't. Issei had the same 12 14-inch, 35.6 centimeter guns as Fuso, and 6 twin turrets. The secondary battery, on the other hand, changed in both layout and the actual weaponry. Fuso had 16 6-inch, 15 centimeter guns spread along the ship in single casements. Issei retained the casemates, but increased the number. Now 20 of the lighter 5.5-inch, 14 centimeter gun. 18 of them in single casemates that didn't extend past the funnels, with the final pair mounted on the deck. This change was made to simplify loading. Lighter shells could be loaded faster and maintain a higher rate of fire, useful for engaging destroyers. Weaponry past this was rounded off by 4 single 3-inch anti-aircraft guns and 6 submerged torpedo tubes, 3 on either broadside. To protect all of this, Issei had a main belt of 299 millimeters or 11.8 inches with a deck of 85 millimeters or 3.3 inches. Alternatively, she had the same 12-inch belt as her predecessor, depending on the source. Meanwhile, the size of the ship was only slightly different from Fuso. Issei was 208 meters, 683 feet long, and 28.6 meters, 94 feet in beam. Fuso, for comparison, was 202.7 meters, or 665 feet long, and had a beam of 28.7 meters. That very slight increase in length was done to improve speed. As could be expected, the increase was also minor. A design speed of 23 knots, with Issei making 23.6 knots on trials, based on 45,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. Fuso was designed for 22 knots on 40,000 shaft horsepower. These changes in hull shape, including a shortened forecastle, did have some unfortunate downsides. Namely, habitability, with Issei sometimes cited as one of the worst Japanese ships to serve on. And that wraps up the design and development, at least for now. So let's move to service. As noted, this began in December 1917, with the ship's working up phase lasting into 1918. Because of this, she saw no combat in the Great War. Not that it really would have made much difference if she was finished sooner. The Japanese kept their capital ships close to home, despite the British trying to get the Congos into the Atlantic. Because of this, Issei would have a quiet life at first. This began with training, but would see the ship patrol off the Siberian coast in 1920. This was in support of the Japanese intervention in Siberia during the Russian Civil War. It wouldn't see any combat for the battleship. As a result, Issei's next notable event did not come from direct action. Instead, it came from a visit by the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII. This came on April 12, 1922. And then she provided support in the aftermath of the Great Kanto earthquake in September 1923. After which, detailed information on her service rather dries up. The 1920s were uneventful, spent mostly on patrol or training duty. Otherwise, nothing of real note until the 1930s. And even this period was mostly quiet on the service front. The noteworthy things for that decade came in a series of refits and modernization. 3 of them to be specific, with the first one technically coming at the tail end of the 1920s. Specifically 1928 through 1929, mostly focused on enlarging the bridge tower and improving aviation facilities. And by aviation facilities, I mean a new flying off platform on her number 5 turret. As for the bridge tower, this was the beginning of what would become the pagoda mast, with that mast added onto in further refits. That said, Issei had a couple years in her first overhaul before going back into dry dock at the end of 1931. This saw more changes to the mast while also adding on 8 127mm 5-inch anti-aircraft guns in 4 twin mounts, as well as 4 40mm pom-poms. The other major change came to the stern, where a catapult and other aircraft handling facilities were added. When this was done, the ship patrolled off China and served as a training ship, in addition to taking part in the state funeral for Admiral Togo on June 15, 1934. After this, Issei went in for her major reconstruction in August 1935. Among other things, her power plant was completely torn out. Issei's old mixed coal and oil boilers were replaced, going from 24 down to 8 new oil-fired models. She also received new turbines. This increased the power to 80,000 shaft horsepower and the speed to around 25 knots, despite an increase in deck armor to 4.7 inches and the fitting of torpedo bulges. In addition to this, the forward funnel was removed while the stern was lengthened by about 7.6 meters or 25 feet. As for the weaponry, the main battery had its elevation increased, aside from the sternmost turret, to 43 degrees. I've also seen reference to both of the aft turrets lacking that increase, or for a third option, the entire main battery increasing to 33 degrees, with turrets 1 through 4 going up to 43 at a later point. Make of that what you will. Regardless, that increased the range for most of the main battery. In addition, 2 of the forward secondary guns were removed, while 10 twin 25mm guns were fitted, and the torpedoes were taken off. More visually noticeable was the mast entering the pagoda stage properly. Not quite as ludicrous as Fuso got, but still notable. This modernization lasted from 1935 through to March 1937, with the ship's displacement going up to 35,800 tons standard and 42,000 tons at the deep load. It was also the final major overhaul before the Second World War, and also the last major event for that matter. Issei would spend the rest of the 1930s either training or patrolling off China. This would last into late 1941, with Issei and Hyuga spending much of their time on this duty. Things only changed in December with the attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 7th, 1941, or December 8th on the Japanese side of the international dateline. If you've watched my Hyuga video, this is going to sound familiar. The two ships served together for the most part. Issei was just a fair bit more lucky than her accident-prone sister. Either way, the battleship stuck close to Japan. She would sortie with Hyuga and the Nagatos on December 8th, but only as far as the Bonin Islands, before returning home, where the Issei class shifted to battle training and overhauls through early 1942. In fact, the ships would mostly remain around Japan all the way into April and another American raid. This time the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942. Issei would set sail to try and track down the Americans. And once again, this would come to nothing, other than intercepting a Soviet merchant ship. So by April 22nd, the battleship was back in Japan, where both of the Issei-class ships would have their own mishaps. Hyuga had a turret explosion on May 5th, 1942, while Issei had her number 2 engine room flood on May 11th due to stuck valves. This would require a short overhaul to repair the flooding damage. Nowhere near as extensive as her sister, however. By the end of May, this was done, and Issei was assigned to distant support for the Aleutian Island invasion at the start of June. As it would turn out, those ships weren't used for this duty. Instead, the Issei sisters were back in Japan by June 17, 1942, where they remained because in the aftermath of the defeat at Midway, the Japanese scrambled for anything they could use as a flight deck. This would see the Issei class converted into battle carriers. Issei would lose her stern turrets, replaced by a 70-meter, 229-foot long flight deck, with a width of 29 meters or 95 feet at its forward end, narrowing to 18 meters, 42 feet at the stern. This was fitted with a pair of catapults supporting a planned total of up to 22 aircraft, both on the flight deck and in a small hangar beneath it. In addition to losing her stern turrets, Issei also lost her original secondary battery, while gaining more 127mm guns, bringing that total up to 16 barrels and 8 twin mounts, supported by 57 25mm guns and 19 triple mountings. In theory, with this modification done, Issei would sail with the carriers and launch dive bombers to support those ships, with the aircraft split between D-4Y Suisei or Judy bombers and E-16 Zuyun or Paul seaplanes. Issei couldn't land her aircraft, so depending on the type, they'd either land on other carriers or on floats beside the ship. As it would turn out, she never put those planes to use. That rebuild began on February 23, 1943. It concluded on August 10th of the same year. Rather quick, all things being equal, but working up would last into October, at which point Issei was put to use as a transport, carrying troops to Truk, where Issei would join up in an attempt to catch American carriers on October 20th. Nothing came of this, and the battleship would be back in Japan by November, where her first brush with American forces came on November 5th. A submarine attack by USS Halibut that damaged the carrier Junyo. Issei avoided any damage here. For the rest of 1943 and into late 1944, Issei remained around Japan, including a refit to bring her 25mm gun total to 104 barrels. She wouldn't leave Japan again until October 1944, when the Issei-class ships were assigned to the Northern Force for Leyte Gulf without any aircraft. This would see them take part in the Battle of Cape Engano on October 25, 1944. In this, Issei took some minor damage. She endured 34 near misses, in addition to one small bomb hit to her second turret. This caused a good amount of flooding, but not enough to put her at risk of sinking. 5 men were lost and 71 injured. While returning to Japan, she evaded a second attempt at torpedoing by USS Halibut. Arriving back in Japan on October 27th, Issei shifted to secondary duty. This would see her sail to Singapore in late 1944, where she would graze a reef and hit a mine in early 1945. After repair work, Issei carried supplies to Japan. She would return home on February 20th and be put into reserve due to a lack of fuel, where she would eventually be sunk on July 28, 1945, after a series of damaging airstrikes. The final attack saw 5 1,000-pound bombs sink her in shallow water, where she would eventually be scrapped in the late 1940s. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.